Good afternoon, church family. Pastor Keven Newsome here, continuing the study on generational ministry and how the generations work in the church. And today we're going to be working on session 4. Session 4 being, we're going to talk about millennials. We're going to do an overview of the millennial generation. We're going to do an overview of Generation Z. So we're going to jump right into it with the millennial generation. Well, first of all, here is the timeline again. Once again, if you want to find where you are in the timeline and where your loved ones, those closest to your friends, are on the timeline. So as we're talking about these generations, you'll have an idea of where they sit and the characteristics, how they might apply to these people in your lives. Also, just as a reminder, I'm going to say this every time. When I talk about these characteristics, I'm talking about an overall emerging characteristic and traits of a generation as a whole, and we're talking about millions of people being a part of a generation, and some of these characteristics may not apply to individuals, may not apply to certain regions, certain families, certain cultures. Things are going to vary depending on where you are, so people are very different, people are individuals, and not every characteristic might apply to you or to people you know. These are characteristics that have been observed by sociologists and cultural anthropologists for entire generation groups. So when I talk about that, please keep that in mind. These are not characteristics that are meant to apply to every individual person. So beginning with the millennial generation, as of 2020, they are or will be between the ages of 20 and 37. Some of the historical landmarks that shaped the millennials, it's not that far different than some of the young Gen Xers. They both grew up in a technologically advanced world that celebrates inclusion and condemns forms of exclusion. The older millennials were children of the 80s, of the late 80s. Most were probably too young to remember the Challenger explosion, but they all remember the Columbia space shuttle tragedy. If the older millennials were paying attention to the news, they might remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. They might remember the Exxon Valdez oil spill, but most likely not. And that's important. These events are important because they represent how the worldview of the millennials was shaped when they were really young. So this Berlin Wall, this social justice, this idea that we need to take care of the environment is a worldview that got shaped when they were very young, and it's something they grew up in. Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama are the only presidents they really remember. Many of their parents went to Kuwait for Desert Storm. To the millennials, Islamic radicals have always been the enemy of the United States. They all watch in horror from their classrooms as the Twin Towers burned and fell. A lot of them saw the second plane crash live on television as teenagers. So terrorism became the enemy. By extension, to many millennials, it was a representation of the evils of all organized religion. They are a generation that has never known advanced technology. To them, a cell phone that couldn't text was old. And why would anyone plug a phone into the wall if it wasn't charging? They've been on Facebook since Facebook began. They've been surfing YouTube since YouTube began. Google has always been a verb to them. If they want to find out the truth of something, they want to read up on something, all they got to do is go to Wikipedia. And I recognize some of you older generations might not even know what that is. Life before the internet really was unfathomable to them. The internet came into being while they were still children. So this life without technology is not something that they have ever really known much of. The world became infinitely small with the ability to video call anyone around the world. We really began to they began to see a worldwide sort of a society, much more so than previous generations. What sets millennials mostly apart from the Gen Xers is that they are the children, or more or less the children of Gen X. Some millennials might have baby boomer parents as well, but what sets them apart is that they're the children of Generation X. So as children of Generation X, they didn't grow up with that stigma of failure that the Gen Xers did. Millennials grew up overcompensated by their Gen X parents. So They grew up feeling like inclusion and acceptance was the normal way of life. Gen Xers want to make sure that they didn't exclude or allow their millennial children to feel excluded in any way. They are the first generation to experience sports that didn't keep score. Every child was a winner, and there were allowances for children with special needs to participate in everything else all the other children could do. Racism sort of became a foreign concept to them. They grew up not really experiencing what other generations did, and so they don't understand lingering racism. Um, they grew up with a heightened sense of social justice and eco-friendliness. I mentioned the Berlin Wall, Exxon Valdez as examples of things that shaped those ideas. If a cause is worth fighting for, they will fight for it, they will support it, they will rally others to their cause. So, in other words, they took the postmodern worldview of truth is relative to the person to another level, saying that your truth should be important to me. Not just accepted, but important. If your cause is important to you, then you are important to them. Then, and if your cause is important to you and you are important to them, then your cause is important to them, and they will make it their cause too. So they begin to identify the cause and the person as going together, not necessarily as separated. And we really see this some when we get into conflict with millennials. If you don't adopt their ideas, then they tend to reject the person, not just the way of thinking. Their major characteristic, first of all, they are a hero generation, which means they are civic minded. Their major characteristic is inclusions. As inclusion, they grew up in a world where everyone had a place and separation for any reason was frowned upon. They value inclusion for themselves, their families, their friends, their communities, any other area of their lives. Similar to the Gen Xers who value respect for all individuals, the difference comes in the personal nature of inclusion. Where Gen Xers want everyone to show respect for everyone else, that's not necessarily inclusion. Millennials want that extra step. They want everyone to be included in everything, regardless of race, gender, or sexual preference. So this is good on the one hand because it better reflects the mentality of Jesus in outreach. It's bad on the other hand because millennials tend to create superficial relationships for the sake of inclusion and are sometimes known for collecting friends as one might collect stamps. Strengths of this generation are they are an accepting generation as inclusionists. Millennials are very quick to accept someone regardless of their past or background. There are no barriers for a millennial, no reason why anyone should be exclusive of anyone else. They are community minded. Millennials recognize the value of helping others, for healing social problems, for building community harmony. They are free thinkers. Millennials will not be told how to think. They want to be free to make up their own minds and to make their own informed decisions. However, they respect and accept different opinions even if they don't include them, so don't try to force yours on them if they don't want to include it. As a bonus, I've included optimistic as a strength indicator of them. These three strengths, accepting, community-minded, free thinkers, sort of merge together to create this sort of unparalleled optimism with the potential for what could happen in the world. So millennials tend to be a very optimistic generation. Weaknesses. Materialistic. They want the best of everything. They will spend extra money for something more extravagant. They will discard something that is perfectly good in order to upgrade to something newer, faster, or better. And they are not known as frugal savers. They can be selfish. They are inherently selfish about what goes on around them. They are accepting of everyone so long as you agree with their definition of accepting. Everything should be for their benefit and their pleasure. They do not practice inclusion because it's right, but because it makes them feel like they're doing the right thing. It comes back to self. They don't help the community for the community, but ultimately for their own sense of self-worth. It comes back to self. In the end, if a project or idea has no intrinsic value for themselves personally, they will not get involved. They can be disrespectful in some ways. Millennials show respect and tolerance for all individuals on the outside, but have little respect for those who do not agree with their definition of respect and tolerance. So it comes back to that inclusion aspect. If they haven't included your ideas in their own, then they show very little respect, very little tolerance for other ideas. Those who don't agree with them, they don't respect. Consequently, older generations with different worldviews who do not agree with what a millennial might stand for are given that little respect, and their ideas are rejected. Their spiritual heritage. So previous generations had the previous generation, Gen X, had almost forsaken the church completely, and many millennials were not brought up in the church in the same numbers that we see from other generations. Gen Xers did not place a priority on church, and they did not force a priority on church onto their children. But millennials didn't take the experience of their Gen X parents as personal to them. So millennials come to church by choice, looking for community, looking for answers, looking for those civic-minded ideas. They tend to objectively evaluate church for truth and inclusiveness and make decisions for what's right for them. Throughout their lives, they have repeatedly seen figures of authority, even in the church, fall from integrity, and so they naturally have a suspicion and a hesitance to give others authority in their lives, especially spiritual authority. So they approach the church the same way, wishing to keep final authority with themselves rather than give authority to a central figure like a pastor. So make no mistake, though, they can be very spiritual people. They just might not always be the most religious people, and there's a very distinct difference between the two. And the church has really been doing a good job of explaining the difference between being spiritual versus being religious. And in part, I believe that has to do with a lot of the millennial influence on the church. Institutional religion to a millennial is not true Christianity. They want the truth. They want genuineness. They don't want something that is built for the sake of tradition, for the sake of religion. Their worldview is postmodern inclusion, which means other people's views about God are worth consideration for including with their own. Their truth statement might be, your truth value is important to me if it is compatible with mine. Truths are adopted and championed by millennials, even if it's not their own, but if it deviates too far from their own accepted truth, then a millennial might dismiss it and ignore it. Ministry challenges to the church. So helping them to understand that the church is under the authority of God and not the authority of an individual. Is something that's really important to teach millennials. That Christianity is about a relationship with Christ, not a relationship to organized religion. Some older generations really cling to the organization part, the institution part of church. Millennials aren't looking for that. They don't want organized institution. They want that genuine relationship. So helping them to find that. And begin stepping away from this organized institutional religion idea as a central focus of church is a challenge for churches. Millennials can be skeptical about tradition for tradition's sake, and like I said, they crave that genuineness in church. They're looking for inclusion in churches. So if a church is demonstrating too much exclusivity in the way they operate, that's going to push millennials away. They see through consumerism, they see through hype. They want to see genuineness out of a church. So church ministry strategies for millennials, they want solid answers to tough questions. They're not afraid to ask the tough questions, and churches shouldn't be afraid to provide them answers. They want the church to be genuine, not to be concerned with the world, and to stop excluding people for any reason. They're not impressed by superficial attempts to be hip or attractive. They want substance underneath. They want reality. They want what's real. They want churches to break down barriers of exclusion. Churches will need to give them social and community tasks, not just church tasks. Like I said, they're very community minded, very eco-friendly, social minded. So churches finding ways to do ministry that involve social community activity, getting out into the community, doing social work sort of thing, will appeal to millennials more so than other generations. They are, and when talking with a millennial, with gospel conversations about Jesus and spiritual things, we would do well to emphasize the inclusivity of the gospel. That inclusive word is a word that resonates with them. So as long as we are showing them that the gospel is inclusive, even if at fault religion may sometimes miss the mark, that's not what Jesus was about. That's not what the gospel is about. The gospel is about including everyone. So that is the millennial generation. We'll move on to Generation Z, and I will confess I spent an entire day doing additional research and talking with Pastor Craig and Pastor Adam. All three of us are parents of Generation Z. In my original writing, there wasn't much included. There was an entire chapter. I basically wrote an entire chapter, new chapter on Generation Z, trying to get you some new information since Generation Z has gotten a little older and we understand a little bit more about them. I wanted to pass this information on to you. As of 2020, they are going to be between the ages of 2 and 19, born between the year 2001 and 2018, more or less, and surely in the years to come, there may be some disagreements about those years. These are some arbitrary years that I have thrown out based on the generation length of previous generations, which are usually around 18 years in length between each generation. So give Generation Z 18 years here. Of course, that also means that as of 2019, we have been given birth to a brand new generation, as I mentioned earlier. So Generation Z are too young to remember 9/11. They grew up in the shadow of its impact, though. All they know of 9/11 is what they've seen through film and read in their textbooks. The world they grew up in has been marred by terrorism. The war on terror has been fought their entire lives. Domestic terrorism threatens them daily in school. They have never not known a fight. Terrorism has always been around them, both at home and abroad. They have grown up with the constant barrage of a 24-hour news cycle pushing all of these negative things to them. Clickbait, fake news, just building this instability in what we know. So this is what they have grown up in. The oldest Gen Z might remember George W. Bush as president, but most of them only know Obama and Trump. The 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent recession marked the economy they grew up under. And now they're facing a new potential recession in the aftermath of COVID-19. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement are the social concerns of their formative years. Younger Gen Z will grow up in an entertainment industry that has completely integrated LGBTQ rights into their programming, with same-sex couples and parents being featured in children's programming. We're seeing even companies like Disney putting same-sex couples into some of their cartoons. Even now, the agenda has been completely integrated into the entertainment industry. So they are growing up with that, and we will have a difficult time trying to shelter them from that sort of thing. And the church will be probably do better to educate rather than try to protect in those matters. During their formative years, the Chicago Cubs won the World Series for the first time in 108 years. They grew up watching the Marvel Universe of movies. They grew up with Netflix and other streaming services. They grew up with technology at their fingertips from the cradle. Technology is everywhere. In science, the first quantum machine was built in 2010. The Rosetta probe successfully landed on a comet. We've discovered liquid on Mars. The first probe reached Pluto. Most Generation Z have never seen or even remember the space shuttle. Some of the oldest ones might be old enough to remember if they were paying attention of the last space shuttle flight, but most likely they don't remember. Climate change has always and continues to be a concern for them. In technology, everything is smart. From smart watches to TVs, virtual assistants like Siri and Alexa are everywhere, integrated into everything. Drones, self-driving cars, Amazon delivery, all these things have always been around. Vaping is replacing smoking. Self-checkout at Walmart and grocery stores have always been available. Gaming, both as a hobby and as a potential career even, and as a sport, has become extremely popular. Their major characteristic, got ahead of myself for a second, they are the first post-Christian generation. So let me talk about that for a second. When we talk about post-Christian, we talk about Gen X and Millennials being a postmodern generation. In other words, truth is relative. Gen Z is the first post-Christian generation. And when we say post-Christian, what we mean is it is the loss of the primacy of the Christian worldview. In other words, most generations grew up with Christianity, especially in the Western cultures, Europe and the United States. Christianity is the primary worldview that shaped our formative years and shaped the way we think about the world, shaped the way we think about people, shaped the way we approach problems. Christianity was that foundation that we built everything on. Gen Z is the first post-Christian generation in that Christianity is no longer the primary worldview that shapes everyone's way of looking at the world. The rise of alternative worldviews have come, such as naturalism, atheism, and things like that. Let's see, environmentalism, nationalism, secularism. So all of these other alternative worldviews have come and are competing to be the primary worldview with which they see the world. So it's affecting politics, it's affecting education, it's affecting entertainment, it's affecting everything they see, everything they do. It's no longer shaped primarily by the Christian worldview. In addition to alternative worldviews, we also see the rise of personal worldviews. So the postmodern idea from Gen X and from Millennials has allowed Gen Z to create their own worldview with which they can then see the world. So that's what we mean by post-Christian. We can no longer assume that someone from Gen Z has even a rudimentary knowledge of anything to do with church or the Bible. We would be shocked by the lack of biblical knowledge in our young people. Just how very, very little. Some of them might recognize the name of Jesus, but he's just the guy on the cross. He's the guy we talk about around Easter. He might be the guy. For some of them, they might not even associate Jesus with Christmas, and to expect them to know someone like Noah or Moses, you might be shocked to know that some of Gen Z wouldn't even know those names. So they're not growing up in any kind of Christian environment. That's what we mean by post-Christian. Their primary characteristic is security and comfort. Security and comfort work together to create this singular characteristic. They've grown up in an insecure world with the recession, the war on terror, the constant threat of school shootings. So this generation clings to the things that give them a sense of security. With the availability of technological opportunities beyond other generations, this generation can find security in the comfort of their own homes. They don't need to take risks. They don't need to put themselves out and put themselves in an insecure or uncomfortable situation, so they simply don't. For some, stepping away from security and comfort is a source of major anxiety. For others, they simply just don't see the need to inconvenience themselves given the wealth of opportunities and information afforded them through modern technology. This is the first generation to delay things like getting their driver's license or their first part-time job. As this generation ages, we will most likely have a higher percentage of failure to launch than other generations, with more Gen Z living at home for longer because they don't need to leave home, even for college. A lot of them can get a college degree from their bedrooms that they grew up in. On the other hand, where they feel confident and secure, they easily thrive and excel. We might have to redefine what failure to launch means. Traditionally, failure to launch means a child fails to leave home and fails to begin to build their own life and their own career, and sort of continues to live off the coattails of their parents. But this generation will have the opportunity to build careers from their home, to build digital careers through digital opportunities, through technology. And so even though they may be living from home, that does not necessarily mean they are not living a successful life or having a successful career. Their strengths: they are digital natives. They were raised entirely on technology. Young Xers experienced tech evolving into its modern form while they were still in college, and millennials absorbed it during grade school. Gen Z have been living with technology since the cradle. They are the first children. Even toddlers can expertly navigate an iPad. They learn how to handle apps and how to do video chatting, how to stream their favorite shows before they learn to read in many cases. By saying they're digital natives, we are saying that they learn the language of technology from infancy in the same way they learn to speak. It's not a learned skill. It's not a second language. It is a native tongue to them. In addition, they tend to integrate online and real-life relationships to the point that they don't distinguish between the two, and can be more comfortable and more open in online social situations than in real-life situations. Another strength is that they celebrate individualism. Gen Xers championed respect for individuals. Millennials championed inclusion for individuals. And both of these concepts are broad ideas, and these broad ideas have evolved into this characteristic that Gen Z celebrates individualism. It's that next logical step between the two. So now that people are respected and included, people must be celebrated for their individual characteristics, likes, dislikes, hobbies, and ideas. They are niche specialists. As an extension of their celebration of individualism, this generation tends to hyper-focus on specific areas of expertise. Those that persevere in these niche specialties have the potential to be great innovators and masters of those specialties. But there's a caveat to that. We will see in their weaknesses in just a moment. In their weaknesses, we have instant gratification. So more so than millennials, who tend to want things right away, Gen Z expects things right away. Most are being raised in an environment that can afford many more opportunities and luxuries than their parents had, and as a result, they have come to expect the best to be available to them whenever they want it. They have trouble waiting and trouble saving money for things they want immediately. They are a very broke generation because they can't not spend their money on something that they want. They are non-committal. They have a lack of perseverance, and this is going to go back to that niche specialty caveat that I had. They have trouble committing completely to a project or skill despite their hyper-focus. In a world of instant gratification, if a thing becomes difficult or stressful, they are quick to move on to something else. They are more likely to spread out their skills into a broad range of beginner or intermediate levels than to really continue and to master on one. They might master that one niche specialty that they're really into, but as far as everything else, they're going to spread those skills out into a broad range of beginner and intermediate levels. They have an external self-identity. Gen Z, more than previous generations, struggles with self-identity. Their self-identity tends to be defined by the things around them, hobbies, interests, friends, families. Older Gen Z are wrestling with this right now, with this question of identity, and it is a major source of stress for them. Really pray for them as they're trying to figure out who they are. Their spiritual heritage. Whereas Gen X and Millennials were both post-modern generation, Gen Z is the first post-Christian generation. So as such, knowledge of the Bible and theology, even the basic knowledge, is no longer a given. Even in the Bible Belt, the level of biblical knowledge is staggeringly low. Gen Z is being raised by Millennial and Gen X parents, both postmodern generations that believe spirituality is for the individual to decide. Their worldview, I'm calling it post-Christian autonomy. Post-Christian being no longer a worldview no longer defined by Christianity. Autonomy mean that their truth values are largely individual in nature. Their truth values are adopted. Truth values are adopted if there is a direct personal benefit to their sense of security and comfort. So that's that autonomy. It is autonomous to other truth values. Every truth value by a Gen Z is going to be slightly different from one to the next. Truth statement they might have is, I will accept your truth if it improves upon my truth. Truth values are assimilated by Gen Z into their current view of truth based on whether or not it improves their truth values. They will talk about truths only when asked, and then usually in a non-committal way, as if their truth values are more liquid than other generations. Ministry challenges. Churches will need Gen Z will need intentional opportunities for socialization. And churches will need to help provide that. Many are comfortable in isolation but secretly crave socialization, even if they don't go out of their way to find it themselves. They may need others to give them opportunities for this. So as this generation ages, they will be very reluctant leaders, preferring to lead only in specific areas where they are most comfortable, preferring those niche specialties of theirs rather than leading in some of their broad skill sets of beginner and intermediate skills. The church will have to find ways to use these unique talents and to encourage them to take larger leadership roles and encourage them to expand their knowledge base. Being digital natives, this generation may experience a disconnect with the spiritual heritage of the church. So the church will need to help them to understand their role in the larger work of the church, of the history of the church and the body of Christ. Ministry strategies. The church will need to be careful not to fix what's broken or to be tempted to cater to culture in an attempt to reach this generation. This generation needs consistency, they need stability, they need security, comfort, but they also need to know what consistency and stability looks like. So much is unclear about how this generation will impact the church. Churches need to be careful not to overthink their strategies, not to overcorrect their attempts to engage them. They need to churches need to just be careful and slow down and take their time, and not to overreact when trying to reach Gen Z. When speaking of spiritual matters, churches should emphasize the security and identity that can be found in a relationship with Christ. All right, so that takes us all through Gen Z. And session 4. I want to remind you, of course, most of this information is compiled in this book that I put together. There's the information. I will send this PDF to you for free if you like, or you can get a copy where this information is available. All right, so that is session 4, overview of Millennials and Generation Z. I will continue next week with session 5. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll continue. God bless.